Reasonable doubt. First time I met DeShawn, I was defending him against charges that he knew were bullshit, and he was looking at me like I was everything that was wrong with the system I was trying to reform. I need to establish context because the contradiction is important. I'm Marcus Chen, lawyer, Harvard Law graduate, partner at a mid-sized criminal defense firm in Los Angeles that specializes in indigent defense contracts and systemic criminal justice reform. I've built my entire professional identity around the belief that the system is broken and that working within it, fighting case by case, precedent by precedent, is how you fix it. DeShawn was looking at the evidence against him and seeing something I was looking at from across a table in a visitation room at the men's central jail downtown. He saw injustice. I saw an opportunity to establish precedent. The charges: assault with a deadly weapon. The reality: DeShawn had been involved in altercation 3 years after his release from prison. He'd been released after serving 12 years for a crime he didn't commit, exonerated by DNA evidence, given a check for $137,000 as compensation, and released back into society with no job training, no housing support, no mental health resources, and the specific trauma of having lost 12 years of his life to the system. 3 years later, he was in another altercation. This time, a knife was involved. This time, the person he'd been in altercation with claimed DeShawn had initiated the violence. And this time, DeShawn faced the prospect of going back to prison, this time as a repeat offender. This time with conviction rates higher because juries distrust people who've already been in the system. When I first met him in the visitation room, he didn't want to talk about legal strategy. He wanted to know why someone like me, someone with my background, my education, my privilege, was defending him. "You don't actually believe I'm innocent," he said. "Not hostile, just factual. You believe in precedent. You believe in establishing that the system has problems. I'm a vehicle for your reform agenda." "That's not," I started. "That's exactly what I am," he said. "I'm a previously incarcerated black man accused of assault. I'm a perfect case to demonstrate systemic bias. From your perspective, whether I'm actually innocent doesn't matter as much as whether I can help you prove that the system is broken." "I think you're innocent," I said. "Based on what?" he asked. "Based on the evidence, or based on the fact that I was already in the system once and know how it works?" "Because those are two different things." "Based on the evidence," I said. "The witness identification is unreliable. The knife wasn't recovered at the scene. The forensic evidence doesn't support the prosecution's narrative. And I think a jury, if presented correctly, will find reasonable doubt." DeShawn was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Reasonable doubt. That's the thing about reasonable doubt. It's not about truth. It's not about innocence. It's about whether the prosecution can prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a legal standard, not a truth standard." "Yes," I said. "That's how the system works. That's exactly why the system is broken," he said. But here's what I didn't understand then. DeShawn wasn't just skeptical of the system. DeShawn had lived the system in ways that I, despite all my legal training, despite all my years of defending people, had only understood theoretically. DeShawn had been arrested at 18 for a crime he didn't commit. He'd been convicted based on eyewitness testimony that was notoriously unreliable. Testimony that research now shows is wrong in about 40% of cases. He'd served 12 years in prison, years where he'd learned to read, taken educational programs, taught other inmates, and somehow maintained a fundamental belief that redemption was possible, even after the system had already destroyed his life once. When he was exonerated through DNA evidence, he came out of prison to a world that had changed. His family had moved on. His mother had passed while he was inside. His younger brother had built a life without him. His entire social network had evolved without his presence. He got a compensation check that was supposed to make up for 12 years of his life. $37,000. That was the state's calculation of what 12 years was worth. He'd tried. He'd gotten employment with an organization that specifically hired formerly incarcerated people. He'd gone to counseling. He'd done the things you're supposed to do when you're released. But the weight of being someone who'd already been in the system, that weight never went away. The distrust never went away. The specific way that having a prison record meant you were assumed guilty of everything. never went away. So when he found himself in an altercation 3 years later, when violence erupted from a situation that probably could have been resolved differently, if he'd had the stability and support and mental health resources that he should have had, he wasn't surprised when he was arrested. He wasn't even surprised when he was charged despite evidence that didn't fully support the prosecution's narrative. What he was surprised about was that someone like me, someone with my background, gave a damn. I knew I was in trouble when I started researching DeShawn's background outside the specific case details. When I started reading about his first conviction, his exoneration, the details of how he'd spent 12 years in prison, when I started understanding not just the legal facts, but the human cost of those facts, I brought him the evidence, the unreliable witness identification, the forensic gaps, the timeline problems with the prosecution's narrative, and I laid it out like a legal argument. Here's what we argue. Here's how we establish reasonable doubt. Here's how we get him acquitted. What about the truth? He asked. The truth is irrelevant to the legal standard, I said. What matters is whether the prosecution can prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But what if the jury votes not guilty and everyone still thinks I did it? He asked. What if I walk out of court and I'm still a black man who was arrested for assault, and the only reason I'm not in prison is because the evidence didn't quite hold up? How is that redemption? It's not redemption, I said. It's acquittal. It's freedom. It's getting to continue your life instead of having it taken from you again. I don't want acquittal, he said quietly. I want exoneration. I want the truth. I want people to know that I didn't do this, that I'm not a violent person, that I'm someone trying to rebuild a life after the system destroyed my first one. Exoneration requires proving innocence, I said. Acquittal only requires creating doubt about guilt. Exoneration is harder to achieve and often not possible without new evidence or testimony. So I should settle for doubt, he asked. I should settle for freedom, I said. And I'm going to fight like hell to get you that. The trial took 3 months to prepare. I built a defense that was technically sound, but emotionally cold. I impeached the witness on her identification procedures. I highlighted the forensic gaps. I created reasonable doubt through systematic dismantling of the prosecution's narrative. But I also met with DeShawn regularly, outside the legal framework. We'd sit in coffee shops near the courthouse, and he'd tell me about his life in prison, about his exoneration, about the specific grief of having your life given back to you 12 years later, and realizing you don't know how to live it anymore. I work at a counseling center now, he told me one afternoon. Peer counseling. I work with people who've been incarcerated, people who are struggling to reintegrate. I tell them my story. I tell them that redemption is possible. But then I keep getting arrested for things I didn't do, and I realize I'm full of shit. Redemption isn't possible in a system that's fundamentally designed to recycle you. The system can change, I said. The system is designed to lock up black people, he said. It's working exactly as intended. You thinking you can reform it from the inside, that's a nice idea. But it's not going to change by lawyers arguing better cases. It's going to change when we burn it down and build something different. I don't believe that, I said. I believe in incremental change. I believe in precedent. I believe in accumulating victories. I believe in staying out of prison, he said. Which is why I'm sitting with you instead of building the fire. The trial itself was almost anticlimactic. The prosecution presented their case. The witness testified and I systematically dismantled her credibility by asking her about the identification procedures, about the lighting, about her certainty level when she'd initially identified him versus now. I presented my evidence. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and came back with a not guilty verdict. DeShawn was free. He walked out of the courthouse and I felt like I should feel victorious. I'd proven my point about the system. I'd created reasonable doubt. I'd kept someone out of prison. But DeShawn looked at me and said, "Now what?" "Now you rebuild your life," I said. "As what?" he asked. "As someone who was charged with assault and found not guilty. As someone who everyone knows was involved in an altercation with a knife. As someone who will still have his name associated with this crime even though I walked." "You're free," I said. "That's what matters. Freedom without redemption is just freedom to keep being a suspect," he said. "But here's what actually changed. I started working with DeShawn outside the courtroom framework. After the trial, DeShawn asked if I'd be willing to volunteer at the counseling center where he worked, not as a lawyer providing legal advice, but as someone who understood systems, who could help build programs that worked with the criminal justice system. Instead of just defending against it, I started going there, started sitting in on peer counseling sessions, started understanding from people who'd actually lived the system what was actually needed. Not better legal arguments, but better reintegration support, better mental health resources, better employment pathways, better housing support. I started talking to my firm about restructuring our work. Instead of just defending people case by case, what if we also built programs that prevented the criminalization in the first place? What if we worked upstream instead of just at the point of crisis? My partners were skeptical. This wasn't profitable work. This wasn't going to advance our firm's reputation in the way winning high-profile cases did. What if we do both? I asked. That's a distraction, they said. Your job is to defend people, not to solve systemic problems. My job is to practice justice, I said. And justice requires both defending people and preventing people from needing defense. In the first place, I was fired. Not officially, not in a dramatic way. But the partnership ended. The salary stopped. The institutional backing disappeared. I didn't have time to be devastated about it because DeShawn immediately asked if I wanted to come work with him. Not at the counseling center that couldn't afford a lawyer, but building something adjacent to it. A legal advocacy organization focused specifically on formerly incarcerated people, specifically on their reintegration, specifically on reducing the chance they'd end up back in the system. You can't make money doing that, my friend said. No, I agreed. But I can make a difference. We incorporated as a non-profit. DeShawn became the executive director. He had the lived experience, the community trust, the specific understanding of what worked and what didn't. I became the legal director. We had one full-time staff member besides us, someone DeShawn knew from his work at the counseling center, someone who'd been incarcerated themselves and knew the specific challenges. The funding came from unexpected places, private donors who believed in reform, foundation grants focused on criminal justice, federal programs designed to reduce recidivism. Within a year, we had enough funding to hire 3 more staff members. Within 2 years, we'd helped 47 formerly incarcerated people navigate legal problems, reintegration challenges, and employment obstacles. We'd worked with 17 of them on actual exoneration cases, where we believed the conviction was wrong and we could prove it. 3 of them had been exonerated by the time we hit our 2-year anniversary. But the real success wasn't in the exonerations. The real success was in the people who didn't get rearrested, in the people who found jobs and kept them, in the people who rebuilt relationships with family, who moved to stable housing, who stopped cycling through the system. DeShawn and I worked so closely that the boundary between professional partnership and personal partnership became unclear. We'd spend 14-hour days at the office and then go home and talk about the cases, the people, the specific injustices we were seeing. We'd share meals in the office kitchen. We'd sit on the roof during lunch and just exist in the same space without needing to talk. Somewhere in there, I kissed him, not as a romantic gesture, but as recognition, as understanding that what we were building together, what we were doing together, was bigger than either of us individually, and that building something that big required love. He kissed me back. Then he said, "You understand that this is never going to be comfortable, right? This work, this organization, what we're trying to do, it's going to keep being hard. The system is still broken. We're just helping people navigate it slightly better." "I know," I said. "But slightly better is something. Slightly better, repeated 1,000 times, might actually become transformation," he said. "That's what I'm hoping for anyway." 1 year after we'd started the organization, we were sitting in our small office to desks for filing cabinets, a waiting area that was really just 3 chairs and a table with old magazines, when a woman came in asking for help. She'd been incarcerated for 15 years. She'd been released 2 years ago with a record for a nonviolent drug offense. She was working a job that paid barely enough to cover rent. She had a daughter she'd never met. The daughter had been born while she was incarcerated and raised by her sister. She wanted to rebuild the relationship with her daughter, but the conditions of her parole and the specific way that being formerly incarcerated made her seem like a threat in any custody situation meant she was stuck in legal limbo. DeShawn and I spent 6 hours with her, mapping out the legal possibilities. We worked with her parole officer to modify the conditions. We connected her with a family counselor who specialized in reunification after incarceration. We helped her navigate employment law so she could look for better paying work without triggering parole violations. 3 months later, she came back to the office. She wanted to volunteer. She wanted to help other women in similar situations navigate the system. That's when I understood what DeShawn had meant about slightly better repeated 1,000 times, becoming transformation. That's when I realized that the system doesn't change through individual cases or brilliant legal arguments. The system changes when people who've been ground up by it decide to stop accepting it and start building alternatives. 3 years later, the organization has grown. We're not a huge nonprofit. We have a staff of 12, an annual budget of about $2 million, and we're located in a slightly nicer office in a mixed community in Los Angeles, where formerly incarcerated people can actually afford to live. DeShawn is the executive director. I'm the legal director. We work together every day. We've been together as a couple, living in a small house that we bought together for 2 years. We haven't gotten married, not because we don't want to, but because the work feels more important right now. The commitment to each other is demonstrated through the work we do together, the vision we share, the specific way we understand that our relationship isn't separate from the organization. It's foundational to it. DeShawn brings the lived experience. He brings the credibility that comes from having actually been in the system, having been exonerated, having dedicated his life to preventing others from being destroyed the way he was destroyed. He brings the specific knowledge of what works and what doesn't. I bring the legal expertise. I bring the ability to navigate courts and bureaucracy. I bring the privilege that comes from my background, the resources, the network, the specific way that being a Harvard-educated lawyer opens doors that are closed to people like DeShawn. Together, we bring something that neither of us could bring alone. We bring the possibility that the system might actually change, not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, case by case, person by person. We're proving that redemption is possible even in a system designed to prevent it. We've exonerated 7 people since we started. We've helped 43 formerly incarcerated people find employment. We've worked with 31 people on reintegration challenges. We've prevented countless people from cycling back into the system. It's not enough. The system is still fundamentally broken. People are still being locked up for nonviolent crimes. The racial disparities in incarceration are still staggering. The conditions in prisons are still inhumane, but we're working on it. We're fighting, and we're doing it together. DeShawn asked me recently why I gave up the law firm, the money, the prestige to do this work, because the law firm was defending people against a broken system. I said, this organization is trying to transform the system so people don't need defense in the first place. That's the dream, he said. That's what we're building toward. Even if we never quite get there, we're getting closer, I said. And we are. Not close enough, not fast enough, but closer than we were when we first met in a visitation room at Men's Central Jail, when DeShawn was looking at me like I was everything that was wrong with the system, and I was looking at him like he was a vehicle for my reform agenda. Now we look at each other like partners, like people who've chosen to dedicate their lives to something bigger than themselves, like to people who understand that justice requires both reasonable doubt and unreasonable hope.